We'll start then with, I think it's actually Rowan Paddy.
Oh, that's all right.
Well,
Bravo.
don't applaud until you hear what I've got to say. Might not deserve that.
Can we turn the background music down?
Yeah.
That's all, by the way.
It's another tent.
Yeah.
Oh, I see,
Yes.
right.
I'll just try and talk loudly. Can you?
Someone has got to ask.
Oh,
All right, okay. So it's my delightful task, I think, to defend hedonism here in Hay, and this is a good place, I think, to defend hedonism. I think I arrived on Thursday night with a friend in her convertible Fiat Spider, which she spent her whole life dreaming of, and I think that's a good dream to have. I know that other people may dream of going to Africa and saving starving children, and I think, you know, she would give money to that. But I also think it's good to have these pleasures in life that one embraces. I'm here to defend the principle that there is a form of moral hedonism, that we are put on this planet, this beautiful planet, and there is a duty to embrace and enjoy the pleasure that we can have there, because it is part of the sort of moral imperative of being here, of you know, giving thanks in that way for having such this fantastic gift of a pleasurable life and having all these senses with which we can enjoy things. I want to tell you how I first found out about the term hedonism. My uncle, who was my sort of favourite older relative, was a lawyer, and when I was little I used to think I want to be a lawyer because my uncle was such a fantastically fun and life-enhancing person. I should also point out that he was very involved with the Church of England, went to Mass every day, and yet at the same time he was a most sort of brilliantly naughty, good fun person to be with, served on a lot of charities, but there was something about him, you just knew he was sort of draining the pleasure out of life. And when I was about 7, I said to him, "What do you do, Uncle John? You know, what's your job?" And he said, "I'm a hedonist." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Go and look it up." So I went to look it up, and it said, you know, a pleasure seeker. And I thought, well, I want to be one of those. That's what I want to be when I grow up. And you know, I think I've pretty much pointed at that, and I feel I'm making, you know, a reasonable job at it. I hope to do better by the time I'm 70. But for me, this concept of moral hedonism is, you know, is a very strong one that I do think most of the people I know who are, in a way, what I would call good, are in some form hedonists. They do embrace a quite simple desire to drink, to make love, to, you know, to enjoy the finer things of life. I don't think that they are sort of ignoring other things because of that. I think it is because they take such joy in life that they are able to help other people, to be generous, to be supportive, to really appreciate that this is, you know, that you take that joy from life and you can spread it. And funnily enough, I've always found the flip side of that, the idea that you shouldn't be sort of pursuing pleasure, that you should be pursuing a sort of finer aesthetic, just moral guidelines without the pleasure principle, very often leads to a form of particular martyrdom, and actually it's almost a sort of selfish impulse. So, well, look at me, I'm doing so much good, you too should be miserable like me, and it can kind of suck the joy out of a room. I think we've all worked with people like that, actually. It's like, you know, I'm doing it all. How can't you see? How dare you knock off and have a glass of wine now? Look at me, how I'm keeping the whole office going single-handed. You think, no, you're making everyone absolutely miserable. So I really do believe this. It's not just this is not just we whipped up this talk. I've been long interested how many people actually of faith I know who I'd also describe as hedonists. And it's one of the reasons I'm actually a sort of, makes me sound a bit like when I say I'm practicing. I'm not a practicing Satanist. I am a occasionally practicing member of the Church of England. But one of the things I like about the Church of England is that I think it has a huge tolerance of human foible. And in fact, you know, when you read bits of the New Testament, a lot of the emphasis is on forgiveness, is on, you know, love thy neighbour as thyself. That is the kind of key tenement. And it seems to me that unless you love yourself, unless you think you are worthy of pleasure, of reward, of finer things of life, of sort of just stopping, looking at a flower, drinking a glass of wine. In fact, one of the most pleasurable things I've done since I've been in Hay. We're staying with a very lovely woman about 5 miles outside Hay, and when we arrived, we thought, look, she's got a hot tub. Do you think we'll be allowed into the hot tub? And then we were told, of course you can use the hot tub. And then we discovered she had a separate fridge for wine, and we knew at once that she was our kind of woman. And, and we sort of thought, there's this sense that you are then with your own kind of person, and you know that they are really believing that it is their duty to enjoy life, to actually sort of say, here I am, this is, you know, this is the one life I'm going to have on this planet, and I'm going to read, you know, here in Hay where people love books, where they love poetry. I mean, let us not forget that much of the greatest poetry is actually centred around the principles of hedonism. We all know the term carpe diem. We all know gather ye rosebuds while ye may. And actually my personal favourite, that Andrew Marvell poem, To My Coy Mistress, which has that wonderful line, you know, the grave is a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. This is sort of why I feel that there is a sense in which all these wonderful things you can do in this life, love, drink, food, that they are all parts of what make life so fine, of what make people so keen to sort of reach the heights, to do good things, to strive for other people's happiness, because you're taking such pleasure in life. And I know I always go on too much, so I'm just going to read something that someone sent me recently. Now this is a very interesting man I met at a dinner. It was a sort of talking event in London, but quite a small dinner for about 16 people, most of whom turned out to be quite high up military brass. There was a very interesting man there who looked a bit like sort of the actor Claude Rains. You know, sort of cross between a good guy and a bad guy, which I suppose is what a lot of hedonists look like. And he was so interesting, such a fascinating person, and he had been a squadron leader. He had joined the RAF just after the war, and he had been involved in lots of interesting trouble spots around the world, all sorts of interesting and slightly nefarious things that I probably better not go into. But he was just a fascinating, warm, and I think intensely moral man who still lectures about counter-espionage technique and teaches young RAF officers all sorts of things. But he sent me this email recently when I was very, very low, and he just said this: I shall allow you into the secret of my cure for female depression. It's different for men. Drink champagne modestly and slowly and continuously, and look at flowers. And then look at a single flower in great detail. This works. I have superintended the procedure as it works. I have never known it fail. That is the first stage. For the second stage, the patient must read P.G. Wodehouse or make love. One of the two. Never both at the same time. But you probably know that already.
Thank you very much indeed. And now we turn to the other end of the platform, possibly the other end of an intellectual position, but we will hear now from Peter Hitchens.
Yes, well, I, of course, wear a barbed wire garter around my upper thigh, which I'll show everybody later. I begin the day with an ice-cold bath, and I end it by reciting penitential psalms, because I am the opposite of a hedonist. That is to say, I think that pleasure sought for its own sake is a futile end, and one which does not, by any means, lead to happiness. And the confusion which is made in modern society between pleasure and happiness is one of the gravest mistakes that we make. Many of us, I think, will have heard people say, and many of us may have said it themselves about periods of their life, we were happy, but we didn't know it. Because the activity of raising small children, or working very hard to establish yourself in your chosen trade, or whatever it was that you were doing, absorbed you so much and seemed at the time in many ways to be quite difficult and stressful and not always filled with pleasure, that you didn't understand at the time just how much happiness it was providing you with. And there is a wonderful passage in one of G.K. Chesterton's, this is the first of two occasions when I'm going to refer to Chesterton, in G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown stories, in which one of the characters says to Father Brown, do you believe in doom? And Father Brown replies, no, but I believe in doomsday, that what we do here matters somewhere else, that we spend much of our life misunderstanding the nature of what we're doing because we see the tapestry from the wrong side and misinterpret the pattern. And certainly my experience of life confirms that a great deal. Many of the things which I thought at the time were going to lead to pleasure and success and many other things turned out to be disastrous and wrong. And many of those things which I was very reluctant to pursue and which people had to persuade me to do with great effort turned out to be the opposite, to be the things which gave me the most satisfaction. And again, looking back on periods of life when I did misunderstand, the numbers of things that I did which now give me great grief, which at the time I passed over, either thinking that they were good or at least excusable, and now knowing that they're not. So I don't think there's any contradiction between that and saying that, yes, there are many, many pleasures to be enjoyed in life. Huge numbers, most of which I don't need to describe to anybody who's lived any kind of life at all. But most of those pleasures come as a reward. Even the cold beer tastes better after a 15-mile walk than it does after nothing. Every one of the pleasures that we've experienced most keenly usually comes at the end. Maybe you've been, I've had tremendous good fortune in my life. So that, for instance, on the few nights when the horrible communist regime in Prague was overthrown and I was surging up and down Wenceslas Square with these gigantic ecstatic crowds, at the end of that, the feeling of joy and of having taken part in an event quite transcendent in its power was unmatched, but it couldn't have happened unless there had been something to overcome. There was a real euphoria as a result of something genuine having happened, and it had begun with acts of courage, with people confronting, and I was in that as well and quite scared, people confronting a very violent and unpleasant police force on those streets, and the euphoria would not have been possible without the danger first. So yes, there are pleasures, but I think they taste better and feel better and are better if they're the result of actions taken which are fundamentally good and worthwhile, and they can't be separated from it. And so the idea that hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake, is the same as the attainment of pleasure by following a genuinely moral and, I will say, hard-working and sometimes self-sacrificial path, it seems to me to be a dangerous falsehood. The pleasures which you get are part of the self-sacrifice, the danger, the hard work. Morality is very much for you. You decide what you should do, what is right or wrong for you. You shouldn't sit like the person in Rowan Pelling's office who sits there saying, I'm marvellous, you're all rotten. Your job is not to criticize them, your job is to criticize yourself, and that is the fundamental function of morality. But on the other hand, if you attempt to live a moral life, you'll get closer to happiness than if you don't. And if you pursue pleasure and nothing else, and pleasure for its own sake, then I think the taste of it will end up cloying and quite possibly sour and in many cases unpleasant.
And for our third position, I turn to London.
Well, interestingly, this time last year I would have addressed you as a really, really accomplished hedonist of some 30 years. I could drink men under the table. In fact, I often felt that I had modelled myself on that first scene in the Indiana Jones film where she's downing shots and watching the men fall one by one. Peter might remember some of the parties that I was at. He left early. I didn't. So I was very successful in this line of life, and I get the quaffing and the sucking and the sniffing and the tasting and the sucking and all of that enjoyment in life, and I mean by sucking cigarettes, please let's not go too far. But I address you now as a Muslim of 8 months, and I'm a teetotaler and I don't smoke. Now, does that make me one of the rag and bones misery brigade? Well, I really hope not. My life is full of joy, it is complete, but the stuff that I get real pleasure out of now, and this is very, very important to consider, is not damaging to me or the people around me. And when you see the word hedonism, I looked at it on the sheet and I thought, and I closed my eyes and I thought, what images do I have of hedonism now? Well, I'll tell you, last night I was coming through Hay, about 11 o'clock at night, and there were 4 16-year-old girls. One of them had vomited on herself, another one was lying there, and they were going, ah! And I thought, whoa, hedonism. Unfortunately, and this might not be totally correct, because there is a wider understanding of the pleasure principle, hedonism has become a very narrowly understood construct. It's become sex and drugs and rock and roll, and those to excess. And if you're asking me, are those things in excess good for society, we really have to say we can look at Hollywood stars to see how much hedonism you can take before, as a human being and as a spirit on this planet, you crumple. So actually, amazingly, and did I ever think a year ago I'd sit on a panel and say, I agree with Peter, the pleasure principle of negotiating your way through life and bringing joy to others, of sniffing the rose but not having the hangover, of making a contribution to society with a smile on your face, but not smoking the cigarette that's going to kill you and make you miss your child's, because it gives you pleasure right there and then. This is something that is better for ourselves and better for society, and I think in that way our understanding of this narrow construct of hedonism is that it's not positive for society at all.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's evidently, as I expected, sort of 2 against 1, and it's certainly your turn to respond. I mean, my understanding actually was that there wasn't really an argument that pleasure is something that one might wish to attain. It seemed to be almost about technique, that is to say, the position appeared to be that if you go for it kind of head on, you're not actually going to get it. And that almost seemed to me like an empirical question. They're saying you actually can't do what you claim to do.
Yeah, I completely disagree, and I have to say that I feel, like Peter, I feel very blessed, but I spend a really, maybe it's an unusually high portion of my life in the moment feeling happy and blessed, feeling that I am living a life that is happy and pleasurable. And I don't think those sort of pleasures can be exhausted, because I don't think, I understand what Lauren was saying, but I don't actually feel that that sort of drinking people under the table is hedonism. It's not my definition of it. I mean, it was you were, in a way, saying that what we call hedonism is very often another thing. But what I'm talking about is, you know, a really quite refined pursuit of pleasure. You know, you're not drinking someone on the table. You're not emptying a bottle of vodka for the sake of it. You're not getting, you don't set out to get out of it, because that is something else. And actually, I think when we talk about decadence and hedonism in society, and that's very often based around binge drinkers, clearly, and people shopping sort of, you know, till they drop in miles. But that's a lot to do with political policy. That's a lot to do with the way urban planning works. Saying, here we've got a bit of prime land, you know, we won't have a park. We'll just put in another shopping centre. Oh, children don't need to be outside. We'll put in a bowling alley. You know, I mean, this sounds trite, that, but actually the way we plan things is so that people sort of rather being pointed at something that is more pleasurable, they're pointed at, well, here's somewhere for you to shop in a concrete alley, and that makes people, I think, feel bored, pointless, and then you drink in a pointless way. But none of that, to me, has anything to do with hedonism, not as I understand it. As I understand it, really, as I say, it was inspired by my wonderful uncle when I was little. I thought, there is somebody leading a good life, but also one of tremendous pleasure. He's really enjoying this one. You know, he's travelling, he's talking to different people, he did a huge amount of charitable work, but at the same time he was always living in the moment in a very inspiring way, and I you know, it really did influence my life, because I sort of lived with parents who didn't really live in that way. I think my father did until he married my mother, actually, when she dragged him back home from abroad and said, you know, it's Africa or me. And I do feel that there is a way of being good but living in the moment and being happy. And I don't actually go, I didn't know I was happy then. I really feel in my life it's been full of moments where I've known I was happy. It's not a lost moment to me. It's really treasured, and I feel lucky. I feel happy at the moment.
Can we contact your uncle? I want to check something with him.
If I can, what you want to personally contact? Yes, you
I,
can contact him later.
I want to check to see whether he really meant it or whether he was just having you on a bit.
No, he certainly meant it.
It's an odd contradiction between the other things that he did. That's all.
So, first of all, I really don't feel the need for this to be a combative session. I think this exploration of what gives people pleasure is something we should all be able to partake in without actually feeling that they're polar opposites. I think the understanding of hedonism isn't a nice glass of champagne in the bath. I think that's a pleasure that is not going to do any damage. I think the word hedonism is a bit more excessive than that, and probably more linked to decadence, a life strategy whereby your personal needs are taken to give you instant gratification over excessively, or even a little bit over the needs of the people around you and the society around you. And it's that selfish impulse that I think we should be exploring here. I'm also really interested to let you know that Rowan might not know this, but you quoted the Quran about 3 times just then. So this idea that faith makes you miserable, in the Quran, God says, and I'm paraphrasing, go and enjoy the bounty of the earth. Now, if sight is hedonism, it's not. We can all enjoy flowers. If drinking a wonderful water from a stream is hedonism, then yes, we're all natural hedonists. But that doesn't leave you with a hangover spiritually, ethically, or socially.
Thank you. I mean, I think we've all looked at what we think hedonism might be. But I noticed that you also, all 3 took positions on the relationship between hedonism and morality. And in different ways. I mean, when you were speaking, you were implying almost that there is a moral imperative being in the world to seek pleasure. That was something in a sense we're here for. I think in your case, when you were talking about the way actually morality is the mechanism, is actually that which leads you towards pleasure. And Peter, you were talking very much in terms of to actually obtain pleasure in the form of happiness. That there, in a sense, has to be a moral sense of deserving. That if you don't deserve, you don't kind of. If it's a reward, then it can be, in a sense, experience, as I understood it. Otherwise, it's unlikely to be. So I just wondered if I could tease
But I don't
out a
think
bit
it's.
more.
I don't think it's pleasure. I think it's happiness. I think we shouldn't. We shouldn't mix the two up. I'm quite prepared to be adversarial about this. I think the adversarial system is the best way of discovering the truth, and in almost all cases. And I think that I should be very firm about this. What morality demands of you is to discover what your duty is and to attempt to do it. And your duty will very often contradict your desire for pleasure and self-satisfaction. And if you and the point about hedonism is it's not the pursuit of pleasure. That's the sentence unfinished. It's the pursuit of pleasure for its own sake. And to make that a principle, now for you, a nice, educated, restrained, middle-class person, the pursuit of pleasure may be a glass of champagne in the hot tub. But for somebody else who applies the same principle without your education and refinement and advantages, it may be ending up vomiting over your shoes in the street at 2 o'clock in the morning, because the principle is the same if all you are pursuing is pleasure.
And sorry, just tease out one bit more. I mean, a lot of this is between morality and happiness. Is pleasure in and of itself then a good thing in the equation between the two? Does it add something?
Pleasure for its own sake, pleasure which arrives as a reward for something done, is not, in my view, pleasure as understood by the hedonist. The hedonist seeks pleasure because there is something available which money can buy, or which is in some other way, or power can obtain, because often pleasure is obtainable through power. In fact, it's one of the most dangerous effects of power is the possibility of attaining pleasure at other people's expense. And everybody who gets into a motor car seems to me to be immediately corrupted by power, in a quite astonishing fashion. But these pleasures are pleasures, independent of any of anything else. They are their own goal. The person who believes in duty does not deny that there are pleasant sensations to be had and to be enjoyed, and indeed is as keen on pointing out that they exist as anybody else. And if they are a religious believer, will say that the existence of many of the delights of the planet are actually signs of the existence of God. But that is not the point we're arguing about. The point we're arguing about is why are you pursuing this, and what are you expecting from it, and is this a principle that you say, right, today I'm going to set out to do what pleases me, or am I going to set out, if possible, to do what is my duty?
Thank you. Can I turn to Sloan again on this issue of really the relationship between sort of good, morality and pleasure? Because my understanding of your position was actually that morality, as I said, was the means. That actually, but it did then seem to imply that pleasure could nevertheless be a goal. In other words, pleasure could be a thing in and of itself. It just has to be achieved through vicariously, as it were, the pursuit of morality. Is that kind of the position?
I think perhaps hedonism as a byproduct of doing good is something that's worth pursuing. I mean, I'm a child of a hedonist and an ex-wife of a hedonist, and let me tell you what happened to them. My father had a tragic accident when I was 11 years old and nearly burnt to death because he was pissed. My husband came off a motorbike drunk. They were both enjoying themselves massively in their hedonistic life. The effect on me as a child, the effect on my children of this hedonistic lifestyle, this go and do what you like lifestyle, is not positive. Now, what we were talking about, which is the other end of the spectrum, and you know, morality is a very kind of difficult area, but let's go for it anyway. Do you get pleasure by doing good? I think, Rowan, perhaps you tried to describe doing good as a kind of martyrdom, you know, like you say, the grandmother who's always doing the washing up and is moaning about it. But what about if you actually genuinely feel happy when you're doing good? Prayer can be hedonistic. People pray an extra prayer because they know it makes them feel good. Me doing extra things for my kids, now I've given up smoking and drinking. Now, only now, gives me great pleasure. It gives me a bigger smile. I want to do more of it because it's feeding me and it makes me happy. And the byproduct of that is their happiness as well. So I'm a pleasure, happiness hedonist.
And again, just to clarify one point, in my understanding, as you said, it may be that you achieve this, as it were, you do moral act and you makes you happy and it's pleasurable, or actually it could be something that you suffer to do, but nevertheless you feel you ought to do it because that is part of your morality. But are you saying that the former is a good thing, that the pleasure is good in and of itself? In other words, yes, either side could be moral, moral through suffering, moral through gaining happiness, but there is something extra to pleasure in itself?
So I think what we're talking about is, do you set out to get pleasure from doing good, or is it an accidental byproduct of doing good? I think the imperative is making an effort, working, I think, to a greater degree for other people is a hedonistic goal, or should be a hedonistic goal for this society, because it can still bring pleasure. But it brings a pleasure to a wider amount of people.
And finally on this, I think you were arguing before that there was a kind of almost a moral position in terms of actually trying to gain pleasure in life as kind of one of the things we are, as it were, here on earth to do. And if that wasn't, I mean, if you just happened to get pleasure, as it were, not because there was any sort of imperative towards it, again, I mean, how does the morality connect with pursuit of pleasure?
I'm just astonished by the idea that it should be immoral to take immediate pleasure in this life. I desperately want my two boys to feel that pleasure freely given and freely taken is a wonderful thing in this life. And clearly, I don't think anyone would disagree that there can be a form of pursuit of self-gratification that is ill-judged and wrong and leads to terrible destruction. But I think we would also all agree there can be a form of moralizing and martyrdom which is equally destructive. I mean, I would say very often more so. And if we were Italian, we would be amazed that we're having this debate at all, that anyone would say that taking, you know, instant pleasure in the moment, pursuing pleasure, could be wrong. I mean, the Italians would be amazed that we would say that. And one of the reasons I think that so many of us are drawn to it as a country and going on holiday there is because there is such a simple delight in life's pleasure, and actually that, however astounding we find it, that they are so forgiving of their politicians' peccadillos, that there is not this automatic rush to judgment all the time that we do here. We seem to be so intent so often on moralizing and sort of feeling that we can judge other people, that we do not sort of look at the morality of our own life. And I think the morality of our own life should be about leading a good life, but a pleasurable life, and enhancing the pleasure of others. And I really do believe that that pleasure, freely and instantly given and taken, can be wonderful. I don't think you always have to work for it. Clearly, sometimes there's a relationship between an endeavour that you've worked incredibly hard for and the wonderful reward. I mean, the most obvious one is labour and giving birth, and that is the most extraordinary payoff for that terrible pain. But I've also had incredibly pleasurable moments that just floated into my lap, and I don't feel that one should in any way feel that is immoral. That seems to me to be purely a form of a gift from God.
Can I just pick up on something you said there? You equated the giving of pleasure and the taking of pleasure. Well, they're two completely different things.
I don't think they are.
Often you did. You said the giving. You said no. The
do.
giving and taking of pleasure as if they were the same thing. The giving of pleasure often involves the loss of it on your own account. And one of the most startling points at which this dilemma presents itself to most adult people is at the point where, when they have children, they have to decide how much of their lives they're going to devote to the raising of those children, and how much they're going to carry on behaving as they did before they had them. And our generation has not proved itself to be particularly meritorious in that struggle between the one and the other, and has tended to say, as much as possible, as far as I can see, park the children in front of the TV set while we do what we used to do, not to change their lives, so as to make those children's lives better. And then there is always the other argument, where people who've married, or indeed not married, but have set up a home together and then decide to split up, is to persuade themselves that the children will be happier if they break up, when what they mean is, we will be happier when we break up. And that is the real message. The truth is, you ask almost any child of a broken marriage, or indeed of a broken child, is they hate the division between their parents more than almost anything else in their lives. But those parents, if you ask them, will say, oh no, Barney, he's fine. He thinks it's wonderful now he's got two homes to go to, because they want to persuade themselves. The giving of pleasure and the taking of pleasure are two very different things, and they should be distinguished very sharply.
To which?
I don't expect the message to be popular. It never was.
No, I disagree, and I think it's like these people who will never take a present from you. Oh no, I can't do that. You have this and that. I mean, it's fantastically. You should be. It's a great gift to be good at receiving things graciously as well as giving them. Both are really gracious things. But I'd also disagree fantastic with Peter. I think we've got this new thing of beating ourselves up and saying we're the worst generation of parents ever. Well, read Ballard's book about his childhood in Singapore. His parents were never there or drinking. My husband was sent away age 7 to boarding school. Barely saw his parents the time he was growing up. We would never dream.
But shouldn't
of
that be
sending
okay
our
if they're
boys away.
hedonists? Shouldn't that be all right?
If who are hedonists?
If the people you're talking about are hedonists,
But they're not, are they?
Good.
Well, we're not.
Because
This is
they're
in
out
fact.
drinking gin and tonic, so it's okay.
No, I'm not talking about my husband's parents, and they were, in fact, probably best described as Scottish Calvinists, and so. Well, I won't go into the. This is part of my experience of people. Well, certainly his father, of having a particularly moral view that doesn't necessarily tie in with the way that you're actually doing things on the ground. I think that a lot of parents are much closer to their children, particularly fathers. Actually, lots of fathers never changed a nappy. My father's generation. Now you have these fantastically hands-on fathers. My husband is a better parent than me. I'm not ashamed to say that. I'm clearly, because I'm a hedonist, and I have a friend in the audience who has 5 children. Her husband is fantastic with those children. So I just will not have this sort of, we are the worst generation ever, because children watch a bit of TV.
Well, I didn't actually say that, but never mind.
I'm interested, in the question of overindulgence leading to insatiable desire, and I think this is where the just having a nice glass of wine at bedtime crosses over into something that's damaging either to parenthood or to society as a whole, and mostly to ourselves. Where is there a tipping point in hedonism? Perhaps you could all tell us, ask us some questions afterwards. What is the point where things go too far? The thing is, with hedonism, once you try to feed a desire, and I used to have a friend on cocaine who'd come around and say, I'm just grazing. He was grazing on his drugs until the big drugs came. And there is that sense that you're waiting for the big hit, that you're waiting for the next big thing, and that the rest of your life is dull compared to that special moment. And if you're living the most of your life in black and white and waiting for those colours that come through things that are doing you harm, then isn't hedonism overindulgence, and the rest of your life is black and white, and you're probably missing out a lot more beautiful moments.
Thank you. I mean, I think we have reached the point where people can indeed ask questions.